Well, good afternoon or good morning, as it happens to be the case where I am at the moment, and welcome to our roundtable, which I'm very excited to be participating and moderating. But before we do, I'll be passing over to Dr. Matthew Amar, who is the Director of Latin America Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence, which is based out of Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. So we have a very international panel. And just before we get started, Dr. Matthew, to let you know, Professor Ian will be joining us in just a few moments as well. So over to you to set the scene.
Thank you, Anton. Kia ora, everyone. Good afternoon again to all of you in the Americas, and good morning to my friends in New Zealand, Australia, or Asia who are watching this panel over breakfast. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you again for the second time in this inaugural QS conference on the Americas after my earlier spotlight address. As you've already explored partnerships with the Americas in earlier sessions, the point of this panel is to examine the Americas' ties to other parts of the world in fresh ways, and to expand your thinking about the international partnerships you could consider. To do so, we brought together an outstanding lineup of speakers from in and beyond the Americas to discuss our theme, expanding the map of opportunity, developing partnerships across regions. The five panelists about to speak to you are all international education pioneers in different ways. Importantly too, because this panel, as Anton said, has been sponsored and created by the Latin America Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence based at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. All have ties to New Zealand and Australia and the Asian region, or are from that region itself. So behind me, you'll see a Pacific-centered map, and that is also referenced by Anton in the new higher education report by QS on Latin America. So I'm going to go from left to right on that map and to introduce the speakers you'll soon be hearing from. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ruth Wallace, Dean of the College of Indigenous Futures, Education and the Arts, and Director of the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University in Australia. Professor Ian Williamson, Dean of the Paul Merage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine, and before that, the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean of Business at my own university. Miguel Iharchiapa, President of the Australian and New Zealand Studies Association of North America, an Associate Professor of International Relations at the Centre for North American Studies and the Pacific Studies Department at the Universidad de Guadalajara, Mexico. Ms. Natalia Rubio, Head of Academic Cooperation at the Universidad de Los Andes, Colombia, is next. She's from the fifth highest university in QS's new Latin American rankings. And lastly, we also have Professor José Celso Freire Jr., Associate Professor for International Affairs at São Paulo State University, and Vice President, and before that President, of FOBI, the Brazilian Association for International Education. Together, these panelists bring the perspectives of university senior leaders, international office directors, leaders of academic associations, or in some cases, a mix of all those roles to our discussion today. Colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you all for accepting our invitation to share your rich experience and academic collaboration and partnership innovation, including with my part of the world, with our attendees. Anton, as we say in both sides of the Pacific, over to you to kick things off.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks, Matthew. Now, what we'll do is follow sort of the introduction, the way in which you've introduced our panelists. I'll start with Ruth to give her introductory remarks and then start moving our way further east.
Thank you very much, Anton, and thank you, Matthew, for that beautiful presentation to get us started, as you say, kick us off. I want to start by, in our tradition, acknowledging that I'm on Kanarakan country and to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands that you are all on, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous or First Nations people that are here in the session today. Being the College of Indigenous Futures in Northern Australia means that partnerships and partnered work that is led by Aboriginal people, so the correct term where I'm from is Aboriginal people. But this means and refers to all First Nations people. But the correct way that we work is by having a high percentage of Indigenous people engaged in the college, engaged in the university, either as lecturers or teachers or as research consultants. And what we've found in partnering with Latin America is that there is an opportunity for Indigenous people to work across nations, to work in a transnational approach. That transnational approach has been able to lead new ways of thinking for higher education, because the strength of people being able to say, this is how we should be working on our country, this is our culture, this is our knowledge, and this is what we need to do in the education institutions through research, through teaching, through partnership, to change our practice and improve outcomes for Aboriginal people, but also for everybody, has been core in the way that we work. So one of the ways that works is through shared leadership. I noticed the paper that we've read in preparing for today has talked about not treating Latin America as source countries. Well, actually, shared leadership is core to the work that we do. And it's by building teams who make decisions together about the best way to do the work that flip the model of research, that change the way that teaching might be done. It might be the order it's done, it might be connecting to traditional knowledges, it might be bringing layers of complexity to work, has been very important because it changes the conversation essentially and helps us see new realities that are more inclusive. We've done that through a range of strategies that I can talk about as we progress today. The next is by developing methodologies. Now, that's gone from methodologies in the way that we teach. So looking at joint degrees, where there might be 1 year in each part of the world. And when that was possible, our students really grew through that because they were able to challenge their thinking and see the world through different eyes, and then bring that home through some critical reflection. So we've done that at master's level, we've done that at PhD level very successfully. And I think for the students, it's been critical in them rethinking their work and what they are meant to be doing and why they are doing it. So that shared leadership in the projects, particularly Indigenous leadership in the work we've done, but also we've seen it in disaster management, has made a radical difference to the way those students learn. We've also now taken that into research and developing research projects around language, around culture in higher education, but also leadership in scientific knowledge, and how that's brought to critical decisions in all of our world, such as climate change, has been very important in challenging and improving the way that research is done and what that means in a policy context. And finally, I think the other thing that's made a big difference is the work we do in higher education authorises different sorts of behaviours. So we've developed micro-credentials for Indigenous learners who are leading new ways in research. Those micro-credentials demonstrate that those people are the right people to be doing research in that place for that work for that time. Now, being able to do that transnationally means that people can draw on a huge network to be able to make decisions about good policy-based research and good evidence-based research, but also can demonstrate who should be working together and why they are the right people to be working together, which can be difficult to negotiate across great distance. But a system that actually does micro-credentialing and builds that authorisation has the opportunity to change the way we work, the way we fund, and the way we value the work that those people have done. And that international network has been absolutely essential. We've done it in other parts of the world as well. And we found that because people are dealing with many of the similar issues, high resource investment, high Indigenous populations, the impacts of colonisation on those people, together they're able to bring together critical thinking that makes a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Ruth. Now, the next person on my list is Miguel for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I would like to start by thanking QS and, of course, the Latin American Center of Asia Pacific Excellence and its director, Dr. Matthew Amar, for the kind invitation to participate with such an experienced group of decision makers and scholars. Today I am speaking in my capacity as president of the Australian and New Zealand Studies Association of North America. an academic association founded in 1989 with the aim of deepening the understanding about Australia and New Zealand in North America, which includes Canada, the United States, and my home country, Mexico. The spirit that has led this association to promote the study of these two Pacific countries through the eyes of several disciplines has been that of building bridges of cooperation across the Pacific. Australia and New Zealand have always been close partners for countries such as Canada and the United States, but also for Mexico. It might sound surprising in the case of Mexico, especially considering that it doesn't share the same values or the same identity as an Anglosphere country like Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. However, as a middle power that has a lot of similarities with these other countries, Mexico has also found some avenues for cooperation with these countries. The aim of building these bridges of cooperation is, of course, to gain more knowledge about issues related and of course issues that interest us all in the Pacific Rim, but also to find ways on how to work together to face the challenges that, of course, affect us all. And in recent years, this has become more urgent. And now, as we are experiencing a global pandemic, new ways of cooperating in the academic sphere are, of course, needed and are becoming a matter of urgent concern. So the association has tried to find ways to think innovatively about the possibilities, not just through organizing conferences in which we academics and diplomats and professionals and policymakers can get together to discuss the most relevant issues, but also by finding other ways to increase our awareness of the topics in which we can work together to improve the state of education in our respective areas of the world. And of course, in this sense, for us, it is very important to work together with not only with academic institutions, but also with governments and of course, other stakeholders that can help us in that endeavor. So the spirit of this organization, of course, is to keep building these bridges. And now that we are experiencing this global pandemic, to take advantage of the new technologies in order to keep cooperating and building on the things that we have done in the past, and now think creatively for the future.
Thank you very much for that, Miguel. Next up on my list is Natalia, for your opening remarks, please.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon and good morning to all of you. I'm really happy and very honored to be part of this panel. So thank you so much for the invitation. So, well, my name is Natalia Rubio, and I serve as Head of Academic Cooperation at Universidad de los Andes, and I'm based in Bogota, Colombia. So while serving as a bridge to connect our programs, our faculty, and our students to opportunities abroad, I have had the opportunity also and the enormous privilege to lead and support our strategy of partnering and connecting with Australia and New Zealand. And this strategy is quite relevant if you consider like the history of Universidad de los Andes. And just to share with you a few details on that, we were created in 1948, a year that we in Colombia consider a turning point in our history because violence was arising and we were facing an intense political turmoil back then. And I find quite significant that a group of young men, they were around 26 years old, thought that the answer to that crisis should be in education and should be related to creating a new institution a new university that should be completely independent from any political, religious, and economic ties, and should be only devoted to achieving academic excellence. And that's how Los Andes was created, and very international from the beginning, with following the American model and with quite important ties to US universities. Later on, our professors and our faculty pursued their PhDs abroad, mostly in the US and in Europe. But I would say that during the last 15 years, we have shifted towards Asia and the Pacific by establishing the first Confucius Institute in Latin America, by opening a Center for Japanese Studies, by engaging with universities and institutions in Australia and New Zealand through student exchange, faculty cooperation, and short courses that we have been able to host through the Prime Minister Scholarship Program. We've also recently joined the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. So this is just to give you a glance on how the map of collaboration has also been expanding within Los Andes, and our perspective, trying to enrich the way we teach, the way we research, the way we commit to our students in order to give them an open perspective of issues and how to deal with them. So basically, that's what I was going to share with you now, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Natalia. Professor Ian, I'll welcome you to the stage to provide your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I should please also say a special hello to Matthew. It's a pleasure to see my colleague on the other side of the Pacific at this moment in time. I should also note, as an Australian citizen, I would just like to take the opportunity to recognize all the traditional owners of the lands that we all represent today, and to give my regards to the elders, both past and present. I think this is a really important topic, primarily because it's at the crux of what I think we're dealing with as a higher education institution globally, in the sense that we've seen tremendous disruption over the last several years, COVID obviously accelerating that, but issues around social issues, how we fund education, and a whole like of other things that are really foundationally challenging some underpinning assumptions of what is an effective educational environment. And in that environment and in that context where people begin to question what role do higher education institutions play, I think it's critical for us in these institutions to really reach out to think about how we're addressing bigger, broader social issues that societies or communities are dealing with. And the only way we're going to be able to accomplish that is through innovation. And certainly what we see is that the most innovative outcomes from an educational perspective are typically the ones that are formed through partnerships. And that ultimately leads to very different approaches, the combination of very complementary skill sets. And so, thinking of the experiences I've had, both living in Australia and living in New Zealand, and leading institutions that form relationships with particularly Latin American organizations and community organizations and universities, I could just see how those partnerships created spaces for innovation, obviously in terms of curriculum opportunities for our students to get exposed to different types of economic models and different types of business structures, collaborative research opportunities that will drive research collaborations and very different perspectives on how we deal with some foundational issues around economic growth and development. But even also, perhaps most foundationally, and I actually think this is where we will see the biggest impact from these types of partnerships, is really rethinking the way in which we create the pipeline of talent that has access to higher education opportunities. And I'll give a specific example of some work of an organization that operates out of Colombia and Brazil, a group called Talento Total, which has a partnership where they develop and identify Black Colombian, Black Brazilian students that historically have not had access to higher education opportunities at the same rate as other members of those society, and try to develop those individuals through exposure, through role modeling, through training and development, since they are prepared to take on opportunities at some of the top universities, both in those countries, but also around the world globally, specifically in the domain of business. and creating pipelines of new talent into higher educational experiences. And having had the chance to work with that organization and visit with students in a wide variety of locations, both in Colombia and in Brazil, have our students, when I was in New Zealand, engage with individuals from those communities, you begin to see how this represents a very foundational opportunity that the partnership models can create, where we're able to collectively bring our resources to expand the pool or the pie of individuals that are able to get access to these institutions. That's where you see the bigger institutional change, but also the broader societal change. And I think that's key, because we share many common challenges. Each of our communities would have groups of individuals that have historically not had as much opportunity to this educational experience. How do we take that expertise and knowledge of understanding those situations, combine it, and create very interesting collaborations that expand that pie? So I'll stop there and look forward to other questions.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Ian. And to round it off, Professor Celso, to provide your opening remarks.
Thanks, Anto. Thanks, Matthew. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I want to thank UAS for the invitation to participate in this important event and say how honored I am to share the session with my colleagues. The invitation made me happy because I was asked to speak about one of the topics that I most like to explore when discussing international cooperation: how higher education institutions worldwide should develop partnerships in Latin America. As stressed by QS, my region is usually seen as a recipient of solutions from economically advanced countries and not a potential source of innovation and research that can balance an international partnership. I hope I will give some inputs and ideas on developing partnerships in Latin America. In this context, I want to explore the importance of the academic missions to Australia and New Zealand, in which I took part with colleagues from several other Brazilian higher education institutions. It shows a perfect example of developing partnerships across regions. These missions, which started soon after the first Brazilian students were sent to both countries during the Science Without Borders program, had the last edition organized and funded by Education New Zealand in January 2020, just before the pandemic. It included representatives from 8 Brazilian higher education and research institutions to deepen or initiate contacts with New Zealand partners. The results have been inspiring and show the importance of developing academic relationships with non-traditional partners, and why not say, are an example of successful so-so partnership development, until recently little explored. The main thing for me is that it has become clear that researchers from higher education institutions in Australia and New Zealand are truly interested in collaborating with their colleagues in Brazil, generating results that can be sharply classified as examples of win-win partnerships. In this initial speech, I also want to mention the obtained results and the role these missions have had in UNESP's new strategic partnership development. Higher education institutions from both countries are actively participating today at UNESP's main internationalization strategies, the Global Research Alliances and the International Research Networks. I hope to have the opportunity to explore in more details some of these issues in the context of partnership development. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for that, Celso. Now, everybody has, a few of the speakers have referenced the higher ed report. I think I've mentioned it a couple of times through the conference, but if you want to access that, you can do so at the QS booth and go to the report section there. In the meantime, I also should remind everybody that if you'd like to ask a question of the roundtable, please feel free to do so during the Q&A. I have a few questions to sort of kick us off, and I think it is appropriate to start with you, Celso, considering you wanted to highlight a lot about the partnerships, and that is what are some of the common misconceptions about developing partnerships within the Americas?
Thanks, Anton. As I mentioned in my opening speech, in the document, Which Way is South, Remapping Higher Education in Latin America, QS produced, one of the most common misconceptions regarding Latin America was stressed. The perception that the region is a recipient of solutions transferred from economically advanced countries and not a potential source of innovation and research that can balance an international partnership. In my opinion, two main reasons are behind this perception. The first one, and I'm sorry to say this, is related to economic interests. Several higher education institutions in the world only see the region as a provider of students. The second, perhaps connected to the first, is related to the lack of knowledge that many institutions have about the scientific potential of higher education institutions in the region. If some world-class universities are already working with strategic partners in the region, many others still need, first, to believe they have opportunities to explore, and second, invest in the development of partnerships. According to the QS World University Rankings by subject in dentistry, for example, there are 3 Brazilian institutions in the top 30. In agriculture and forestry, in the top 100, there are 4 from Latin America. A lot of opportunities could be explored. Maybe people just need to discover it. However, it is also true that the region's institutions need to better develop the internationalization strategies, including promoting their competences.
Thank you very much for that, Celso. I'll start going backwards the other way now. Natalia, for you, what do you see are some of the common misconceptions? Apologies, they're starting to rain and a bit of thunder in the background now. What do you see as some of the common misconceptions around forming partnerships?
Thank you, Anton. Yeah, I definitely agree that being perceived as providers of students for language courses, for short courses, and for full graduate programs is one of the main misconceptions. And it's like ironic because usually based on location, Latin America falls out of the radar. And then when it is on the radar, it becomes a target but is perceived as a market to be conquered. So, and it's quite tricky and challenging to turn that upside down, because if you see, for example, the numbers of international students currently studying in Australia and the countries they come from. So Colombia is in the 6th place, just behind China, behind Malaysia, behind Vietnam, and Nepal and India. So it's Colombia in the 6th place, and then followed by Brazil. So, I mean, that's the data that's currently and actually happening. But I guess the tricky part is to stay just with that perception of being just a source of students. I will also add to that safety perceptions and paradigms, like it's not safe to come to this part of the world. All the political and economic crisis, and even more now after the pandemic, turns out into a challenging destination for international people. And third place, I would say also language as a barrier, like the fact that we actually speak different languages and it's only seen as a wall instead of an opportunity. And as Celso was saying, the lack of knowledge, but not only within the huge potential within our institutions, but also in how our educational systems work. And the reason I mentioned that is because, for example, in Europe, it's very common that public institutions are the only ones that can be research driven or it can be high quality institutions. And then in Latin America, and specifically in Colombia, it's completely different. I mean, you can still have private institutions that are committed to research and that are high quality universities as well. So this is quite interesting to shift once we receive visitors or delegations that are interested in exploring, but are not considering private institutions as the ones to partner with. So yeah, thank you. I would say that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Natalia. It occurs to me in looking and covering Latin America quite a bit, it's a bit of a hybrid blend of the American system and the European system, which is similar to Australia and New Zealand, which leads me to ask Miguel. I'll flip the question on its head a little bit and say, what are some of the common misconceptions of establishing external partnerships that are present within the region rather than misconceptions of the region itself?
Well, I think that I will follow up on the comments of my colleagues, Natalia and Celso. First of all, I think there's also besides the barrier of language and of course, this misconception about the region as a provider of students, I think there are also some fears that we need to overcome as in Latin America, because I strongly believe that several institutions are afraid of building partnerships with universities and institutions outside Latin America because they fear that there is a clear gap between not only the capabilities, the material capabilities and the infrastructure of universities abroad, but also in terms of the knowledge production, scientific research, and so on. And therefore, there is this fear that it will be an unequal relationship in which there will be nothing of interest for our partners outside the region. And I think this is a very common misconception of Latin American institutions that are too afraid of building these bridges because they think that we won't interest our partners across other regions, right? And I also believe that one of the key problems that we have here is that sometimes the lack of exposure to other and I will speak specifically about Mexico, the lack of exposure to other countries that are not the United States have also contributed to this problem. The dominance of the United States in the minds of academia in Latin America has also contributed to a lack of interest for building partnerships with other countries and universities from other countries. You know, the idea of Ivy League universities being the best and the ones that we should look up to has also diminished our ability to think outside the box and to look beyond the limits of the Western Hemisphere. And I think this is another problem for all of us in Latin American institutions, that we haven't surpassed this need to look at the example of American universities instead of thinking about other innovative systems and to go beyond the American system.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Miguel. Now, I want to move on to another area, and this was touched on by both Ruth and Professor Ian. Let me have a look at my question. Sorry. That is around Indigenous peoples. Australia and New Zealand have their own Indigenous populations, but equally so does South America and Central America as well. So I will put to you first, Professor Ian, where do you see the role in developing more active participation of Indigenous people in education, both as participants and bringing that learning into the curriculum within a Latin American context?
I think it's quite critical the one of the key things that I've learned over the years and having the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities in both Australia and New Zealand and other settings as well, is from a business education perspective, which is my background, the importance of having a business education that starts with the notion of cultural appropriateness, because it begins to shape the opportunity set that you see around how you view opportunities, which opportunities you would pursue, and the way in which you go about doing that. And when you don't start with that as a foundational component, what you find is oftentimes the educational experience will be alienating to other parts of your student body or communities that you're trying to serve. But by the same token, when you bring that cultural appropriateness in and you bring in Indigenous values and perspectives into the way in which you shape the curriculum, you also begin to get different framings of how you approach certain problems. And I think one of the key areas, just to illustrate a point, would be the way we think about sustainable business models and the way we think about time and how we would engage in business modeling activities. And so it was very common for me in my activities when I engaged with Maori communities for us to have a strategic plan process, which in most organizations would be 5 years, maybe 10. For them, it's 50 years, maybe 100. And so when you think about activity over a period of time in that way of thinking from that particular lens, you think about the impact that has on the environment, the way you think about wealth and wealth generation, it completely changes the whole notion of how you would frame, organize, and manage your organization. So one, it becomes more appropriate to a different audience, but also brings innovations to other audiences, non-Indigenous audiences, to think about how they deal with some of the more pressing issues that we're seeing right now in organizations and communities around the world. So it enriches the experience, it makes it much more accessible to a wider range of individuals, and certainly it allows us to sort of take advantage of the cultural expertise that exists within these communities.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Ian. And I can see that those perspectives also translate through to a lot of the other points that were being made around misconceptions, both of Latin America and also internally in Latin America outside as well. Ruth, for you, how do you see the role of and the importance of including the Indigenous people within education?
So we can take two approaches. One is very similar to what Natalia and Celso and Miguel have described, which is an asset stripping approach, which is going and mining for students. And that is just happening exactly the same for Indigenous students and Indigenous staff. And people know when you look at them, whether you're looking at the dollar sign above their head or whether you're really looking at that person. So I think there's that same problem sits there, but the opportunity that Ian's talking about is absolutely embedded in the work. We all live in an Indigenous world. We all live on Indigenous lands. We all need to engage with Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge to successfully do our work. And not only successfully, but to be enriched, to do a better job, to be able to understand the complexity of the work. I'm reminded of some students last night who were in our Yolngu Mata class, which is a language and culture class, who came to me last night. Their heads were spinning, they'd been in a kinship session, and they said, it's just so complex. Every time I think I've got it, it slips away and then I've got to grab it again. Now that's learning language and kinship. If you're working in a policy structure, in implementing a health program or an education program, if you do not understand that complexity within that world, how will you ever build a program that meets the needs of the people you are meant to be working with, but also of that institution and the goals of the government or an NGO or whoever you're working with? For me, what's really important is the ability to see an institution, to see knowledges from a different perspective, to challenge some of the underlying misconceptions, some of the ways of working that have been ingrained for a very long time, and to bring in different forms of knowledge that can help us understand our world and make a difference. I'm thinking of when we visited Natalia and her wonderful university, the ability to go and meet with people who were thinking about similar issues but from different perspectives, and then to take that critique back into the work that we were doing was very powerful. And we can see so much opportunity there. So for doing that with Indigenous people, it's the ability to say, how will this education system work to actually make a difference? How will we build policy or professional people who will be able to take on the challenges of the future? And how do we not just live in an Indigenous world unknowingly most of the time, but how do we build a partnered future that will actually lead us into where we need to be? Do not forget, there is so much knowledge in the Indigenous world we need for our future.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And obviously, I'm Australian as well. And at the tail end of 2019, the country was on fire. And a lot of Indigenous elders had been speaking that if they had been taking up a lot of the land management care, maybe this could have been avoided at some capacity. I will open up the floor to anybody else if they would like to add on to the points that Ruth and Ian have made. Otherwise, we can move on to the next question. I'm seeing nobody respond. So let's move on to the next point. Now, we've already touched on how we can overcome some of the misconceptions touched on earlier. The panel obviously is entitled Expanding the Map of Opportunities and comes out from after the aforementioned higher ed report for the Latin American rankings. What does remapping mean? What does it mean to recontextualize this map? How does a shift in thinking have broader effects on strategic plannings and operations? I'm going to pick on Miguel for the first at the start to sort of unpack that quite heavy question.
Well, I think that the maps in the minds of everyone, not just of leaders and policymakers and those that make decisions for academic organizations and institutions, have real world consequences. And they end up having a strong impact in all of our actions. So what I think we need to do is to exactly change the conceptions that we have of the maps within our minds, and not to think in geographical terms, not to think in terms of distances. We need to think in terms of common interests, common values, common preoccupations, and to find out and reach out to partners that may have the same problems, that may be facing the same obstacles, and to look for fruitful partnerships. In my case, for example, I am, besides being the president of ANZANA, I'm also a professor of international relations at the University of Guadalajara, which ranked 44th in the report, in the QS reports in Latin America. And I'm affiliated to the Pacific Studies Department, a department that has always tried to build connections with universities across the Pacific, even if the distance is enormous. And this department has existed for more than 30 years. So even when back then there were no technologies were not as advanced as they are now, we always strive for creating these connections. And now we have partners all over the Pacific Rim, and now we even have a program in a master's program in Trans-Pacific Studies. We have exchange programs and partnership programs with the Kanda University of International Studies in Japan, the Xiaoyongtong Liverpool University in Shanghai, well, in Suzhou in China. And this came out of a common concern of being able to work together in all those topics that preoccupy us both sides of the Pacific. So I think that one way to overcome all these obstacles is by thinking in terms, as I said, of our common interests rather than geographical distance or ideas of regions.
I really like that. That's a very good point. Natalia, for you, what does recontextualizing that map mean?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Miguel. I think that new approaches are needed towards teaching and research, and we need to start opening to unfamiliar context in the road to build strategic and significant partnerships. And I think that that new approach, or those new approaches, should start building up from the context that we have in Latin America. So the higher education report mentioned or highlighted the challenges regarding access to education and access to funding. So that's where we should start building up and start responding to those kind of challenges that are very local, but that certainly are shared with other countries in far away, but that we share, as Miguel was saying, same challenges, same difficulties, same struggles, and we can definitely get together and share possibilities and build from that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Celso, what does it mean for you to recontextualize and remap higher education?
In this panel, the issue of overcoming misconceptions about cooperation in Latin American higher education institutions has in some way already been addressed. Therefore, my reflection assumes that the interest and opportunity to cooperate with institutions are already defined. It should be. The next step would be, in my view, to develop an institutional relationship based on scientific interests, in the case of my university at least. With the trust built up, one could move on to developing concrete actions on a large scale. And to give an example, I will talk about the global research alliances and the international research networks being implemented at UNESP. UNESP's strategic plan for internationalization defines two approaches for international cooperation. The first is called international research networks, characterized as a bottom-up approach, since the researchers propose the international partners based on scientific quality criteria. The second, called global research alliances, implements a top-down approach, since the international partners are defined from the interests and needs expressed by the institution's international and research offices. The second approach aims to create a platform for cooperation through which, for example, partners could offer joint courses to students or have access to international funding in all parts of the world. Currently, there are 77 international research networks involving 1,321 researchers, 566 of them from 448 international higher education institutions. There are also 7 global research alliances involving 449 researchers, 264 of which are from 26 international higher education institutions. In relation to Australia and New Zealand, it is important to note that 4 of the global research alliances have partners from these countries. In the specific case of alliances, intense strategic planning was developed for the institutional construction of the partnerships. There was a positive response from several world-class universities, including the offer, for example, of tuition waivers. The result was the product of close work with partners, missions, I mentioned, visits, delegation receptions, and most important, co-funded research workshops in Brazil and abroad. It is important to emphasize that after the first step of partnership building has been taken, developing new partnerships gets more accessible. Sometimes higher education institutions start to discover their competitors are working with higher education institutions in the region. At other times, they identify an excellent cooperation framework. This, in my opinion, show how things could be recontextualized in the region.
Thank you very much for that, Celso. I suppose I would like to invite both Ruth and Ian to participate in this as well. Obviously, with Indigenous people, there are different types of maps as well. I think Australia has 400 different nations, or more than 400 different nations. So what does recontextualizing that map within, on the other side of the world, mean for you, and the impact of that on broader thinking, Ruth?
I think look, I'm a quite practical person, so I think all the things that Celso's talked about are fantastic. So what's the next stage below that that makes this piece work around Indigenous connections? Everything's about governance of knowledge and governance of partnerships. If you don't have the right person speaking at the right time, who's authorised to speak, who knows who should be involved, who's able to navigate complexity and work across a number of knowledge systems, everything falls over every time. So I think the thing that underpins what Celso is talking about is building local leadership that will be Indigenous people who are the right people to speak for that country at that time. In Australia, where I live, that means a shared leadership model. It's quite a flat leadership model about who has the right knowledge at the right time in that right place. So it's very dispersed. It's not a hierarchical model at all. And when we've worked with other countries, it's a very different system. So people need to be able to learn about each other. They need to be able to experience how decisions are made, because that opens the door to understanding then how the partnership will work. So that's, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Then building the capacity of the people who are the local leaders to be in a position to say, this is how we should work it, not on an advisory board, not on the reference committee, but actually in positions of decision-making about where resources will be spent, about who will be meeting, about who will be involved, so that, and what will be discussed, so that there is a change in the paradigm for local leadership, local voices, and local power is starting to shift. Once people start working together and you build the capacity of those leaders, they will then start to build the next agenda that will layer in different ways of working. And one other thing I think is quite a practical part of this is publication. For people to work together and to do things that are practical across languages, being able to think and write together gives you the time frame and the space to actually analyse and argue and critique different work that may not be accessible to someone who's from a different language base. And working in Indigenous communities, well, from where I live, around here, there's about 100 languages just in this region, and many of those are not related. They're as different as a European language from an Asian language. So by being able to write together and being able to critique that work across languages and publish together in that way, people start to build a knowledge base which will inform that local leadership and that decision making. And that to me is core in being able to reach out and say, we've got an opportunity through a large research partnership or a opportunity through government relationships to be able to build investment. Then you've got the basis to have those conversations. Otherwise, it will collapse under the weight of being able to make very difficult decisions in a short time.
Thank you very much for that. It also reminds me, and I don't mean to plug all the QS publications, but the most recent Global Education News, the cover is on reassessing assessment and talks a little bit about some of the barriers around research collaboration and the systemic sort of biases that occur in that, especially around those who are not necessarily speaking English. Professor Ian, I'll invite you to add any remarks that you'd like to add before moving on to our next topic.
I think the most foundational component around much of this discussion from a higher education perspective is really reconceptualizing the talent pipeline of faculty members that we have in higher education institutions. And so, you know, inherent in what Professor Ruth was just speaking to, and some of the other comments, if we do not have representation in the academic ranks with individuals bringing not just their technical capability, but also cultural competencies and understandings, then it becomes very difficult for us to really conceptualize how the partnerships that we will form will, one, be relevant to all segments of the societies that we're talking about, but also lasting. And so this core issue around lack of representation of various communities in the faculty, the PhD pathways, the actual instructors, that's relevant in New Zealand, that's relevant in Australia, that's relevant across South American countries, that's relevant in America. And so I think if there were one thing that I would want to focus on as a way to create sustainable partnership activity that really captured the attention of communities, it'd be very systematic processes to enhance this huge disparate representation issue that you see across all these various communities, which has big implications about what we can and cannot teach and how we conceptualize problems and who we can and cannot partner with.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Professor Ian. I do want to take the opportunity to ask one of the questions we've received through. We're quickly running out of time, but we might be able to push on a little bit further. Vivian Verdeguez, apologies, I have butchered your surname, says, since language is still a barrier for internationalization, which strategies would be more effective to solve it in a short time? I will go to you, Celso, around that barrier. And if we can be quick on this one, because we'll move on to our final question.
Anton, in some way, for me, we should to have international offices working close. In some way, I have the impression that in different parts of the world, international offices are an office to work with students. And we are trying to change the situation in Brazil in a way that we are working very closely with the research office, with the postgraduate office, to have this research aspect driven the international cooperation. In the case of my university, which is a research intensive university, I know that for other types of university, you could use another approaches. But in my case, what we are doing is having the international offices working closely. I mentioned those 7 global research alliances, just to say that we had dozens of meetings with vice presidents, with international offices, with people to try to build institutional partnerships. And in my opinion, it is a way to move forward, at least for institutions in Latin America, try to build institutional relationships.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Natalia, do you have any thoughts on how to quickly solve, or in a short time solve, the language barrier?
Yes, well, it certainly is a barrier. I mean, it's one of the key things that keeps international students from coming to us, because our mainly language of instruction is Spanish. However, I think when we partner with English-speaking countries, we can definitely design innovative ways to maintain English as the main language in the course or in the program we're creating together, but also open international students to the world of possibilities that learning a second language like Spanish can open. So I think it's a bit demanding, because definitely we need to sit together and come up with ideas in which Spanish, in this case, gets involved into the program, but we'll still teach in English. I mean, it's easier for international population and our target, basically. Yeah.
Anton, can I add one point? That
yes,
as
please.
we are talking about rankings, as Natalia mentioned, Portuguese and Spanish are in the top 6 most spoken languages in the world. When we talk about global knowledge, global societies, Spanish more than Portuguese, but Portuguese also are 2 very important languages. And I believe we should put this fact on the table. It is important for students from other parts of the world to know other languages. English is the lingua franca, but there are other languages that are also important.
Yes, no, absolutely. You're correct in that. In those observations. I had a point that I was going to make, but you made it better than I can, Celso, so we'll move on. Actually, before we do move on, I thought perhaps, Ruth, if you have any perspectives, you were talking about finding a common language. Are there quick ways to sort of do that?
One of the things that have really surprised us through COVID is the things that we said were impossible. They would never happen and we couldn't do it. One of our programs is global mobility, and also we do our global mobility into Indigenous communities as well, so people learn the cultures here. And it was going to be impossible to do that during COVID times because we didn't want to take COVID out to very vulnerable populations in remote areas. We have been doing study tours online, and so that's across several, so you might be speaking 5 or 6 languages when you go to a remote community. And it's worked a dream. And I'm really quite astonished at how much the students have got out of reaching out through COVID, because we've essentially retrained our students and ourselves to think and work in a new way. So I think there is a way to do it by using strong, for Indigenous contexts, it's about having a strong underpinning of understanding diplomacy and how to work across language. So not only business, but I think we need to invest in the diplomacy side And that would mean we could do global mobility tomorrow into each other's countries together. That would change radically how students think about how they partner. And then that could change the curriculum in the courses, and then that could change the research projects. So I think we've got to use this opportunity to completely change our practice, as we're already there.
Absolutely. We are very quickly running out of time. So I'll move on to our final question. Miguel, if you could redraw the map of higher education, what points of interest would you highlight within the Americas?
Well, I think the first things I would do is to look outside the Western Hemisphere, to go beyond collaboration within the region, and to think about potential partnerships that we can come up with across the Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific Oceans, and to find all these other institutions that we can work with, our common challenges, our common problems, and to look for new opportunities to come over the challenges of barrier languages, for example. Maybe think about content language integrated learning. We can think also about, as Professor Ruth said, trying to have these experiences of global education without the need of actually being there. And in this way, I think we can use new technologies to actually think innovatively. And I think that the global pandemic has helped us to do this, to think creatively, to think innovatively, and to look for better ways to work as a humanity, not just as nations, just as states divided by borders, but as human beings that face common challenges, common problems, common obstacles. And therefore, I do something about geography when looking for partnerships across the world.
Thank you very much for that, Miguel. We are very quickly running out of time. So thank you very much to all those for talking with me. I'll pass it back to Dr. Matthew to give his summary of it, of everything we've heard.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you, everyone. This has been a tremendously rich and productive exchange. I know I've learned a lot from it. We hit some common themes here. We talked about the need to innovate and the urgency of innovation. We also talked, however, about that we have to be inclusive. We have to make our systems, our teaching, our research practices, even our internationalization more accessible to all parts of our community. And one way to do so is by thinking about common values, interests, and strengths. So all this can be the basis for new partnerships. For speaking on behalf of my CAPE, the Latin America Center of Asia Pacific Excellence, we work really closely to raise the capability of our own people, to develop the talent pipelines that we talked about, to put Latin America on the map, and to develop intercultural capabilities and competencies. But we can't do it alone. We're part of a consortium of 4 New Zealand universities, but we need our international partners. And on that note, it's just been wonderful to hear the views of some of those leading partners in this exchange. Given us much to reflect on. We wish to continue reaching out to you and to your colleagues and to working together to build ties across this map behind me and to expand our own mental maps. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Matthew. And again, thank you very much to the panel. I very much enjoyed listening to everything, and I hope the audience did as well. I do know that we have a couple of questions that were left. Unfortunately, we didn't get to answer those. Where I can, I will try to pass those on and see if we can answer that in the platform. Speaking of which, it's time to move away from Zoom and back onto the conference platform that we're using. We will take a very quick break, but go into those rooms there. We will have our closing keynote by Dr. Chowki T. Abdullah, who's a professor and executive vice president for research, Georgia Institute of Technology, followed with the closing remarks by Monica Hanun-Katan, who's head of programs at QS Quacquarelli Simmons. If you find yourself with a little bit of time to do so, please do visit the QS booth and download our reports. I would be eternally grateful. And again, thank you very much to all the panels as well. Have a good rest of the conference. Okay. Most of the delegates are now